Could you live on this? Not for a day, not as an experiment, but every day, in winter and in spring, in years of plenty, and in years when the harvest thins. You lift the bread and feel its weight in your hand. It is heavier than you expect, not heavy like a stone or a tool, but heavy in the dense, deliberate way of food, made from the coarsest flour the miller will grind for those who cannot pay for better. It has risen only part way and come from the oven dark and close-grained, smelling strongly of the grain itself. The rye with its deep earthiness and faint bitterness, the taste that has not been sifted or softened or refined away. This bread has not been purified into lightness. It carries the whole of the field in it. And for a medieval serf, this is not a side dish or an accompaniment. This bread is most of what there is, today and tomorrow, and the day after that. The steady, unvaried foundation of a life lived close to the soil. You hold it in both hands, and you feel the weight of it, and you understand, before you have taken a bite, that this bread is a different category of thing from the bread you know. The bread you know is a vehicle, a carrier, something you put other things on top of or between. This bread is not a vehicle. This bread is the meal. The other things, when there are other things, are what you put on top of the bread, and they are additions to the substance, not the substance itself. You tear a piece. The crumb is tight and grey-brown, the bran still in it. The whole grain ground with a thoroughness that leaves nothing out, nothing discarded, because in a household where grain is counted against the winter's length, there is no category of thing that can be discarded. The crust is hard enough to require effort. You bring it to your mouth and you chew, and the taste arrives in layers. The rye first, that dark, almost bitter earthiness. Then the slight sourness of the leaven. Then something underneath both of those that is simply the taste of grain being grain, of food in its most direct form, of something that has come from the ground and been minimally transformed and is now here, inside you, doing what food does. You chew for a long time. This too is different. This bread requires chewing in a way that softer, lighter bread does not. The jaw works. The dense crumb takes time to break down, to release its starch to the saliva, to become something that can be swallowed. There is a quality to this process that is not unpleasant. The flavor deepens as you chew, the rye opening up, the slight sweetness that lies under the bitterness becoming available after the first 30 seconds of working. But it requires your attention in a way that eating rarely requires attention for those who have grown up eating things that do not demand it. The bread fills. This is the other thing. It fills. You have eaten a piece the size of your fist, and you are aware of it in your stomach in a way that is different from the awareness that lighter food produces. A density, a presence, a something down there that is working on the problem of being digested. The rye and the bran and the close-packed starch are releasing their energy slowly, as they were always going to, the body processing them over hours rather than minutes, the fullness that comes from this bread lasting in a way that the fullness from white bread almost never lasts. This is not accidental. This is the bread doing exactly what it was made to do, sustaining the body of a person who works hard for a long time on what the land can produce. The serf knows this about the bread the way the serf knows everything about food, not from analysis, not from the language of nutrition or digestion, but from the body's own experience over a lifetime of eating it. The body that has grown up on rye bread has learned the bread the way it has learned the work of the fields, not as information about the work, but as the work itself, as the shape of a life built around specific conditions. The bread is those conditions made edible. You eat the rest of the piece. You are still hungry. The hunger is not the hunger of having eaten nothing. It is the hunger of a body that has learned what it is going to be fed and is already calculating the distance between that and what it wants. The body's baseline expectations, having been formed by a life of eating differently, of eating things that were more various and more calorie-dense, and more immediately satisfying in the way of fats and sugars, and the things the body was, over millions of years, evolved to find appealing precisely because they were rare. The serf's body has been calibrated to this bread, to this life, to a diet that provides what it provides and not what it does not. Your body has not been calibrated to this. Your body is confused. You cut another piece and you eat it. The morning is the bread morning, the first meal of the day taken in the early light before the work begins, and the bread is accompanied today by what it is often accompanied by in the months of reasonable plenty: a small amount of hard cheese, pressed and aged, the flavor of it sharp and direct, the fat of it a genuine richness in the context of a meal that has very little other fat in it, the cheese providing in its small portion something that the bread cannot, the concentrated dairy richness of an animal whose milk has been cooked down and pressed and preserved, the summer's grassland in a rind. You eat the cheese with the bread, the two together making something more complete than either alone, the fat of the cheese carrying the flavor of the rye in a way that the rye alone does not achieve. There is a cup of ale. The ale is thin, what is called small ale, the thinnest of the brewings, made from the last runnings of the mash after the stronger ale has been drawn off, a drink of very low strength that is more like a thin grain broth than what you might understand as beer. It is slightly sour, slightly yeasty, the fermentation present in the flavor but not dominant. You drink it because it is what there is to drink, because the water from the well on a morning after rain carries things in it that the ale, having been boiled in its making, does not carry, because the body of a person who works outdoors in all weathers needs liquid, and this is the liquid that is safe and available. It is not bad. It is also not what you want when you are thirsty. You want water, clear and cold, drawn from whatever clean source your life has access to. The serf wants the same thing, and sometimes has it. The stream above the village, on a dry summer, is cleaner than the well after rain. But mostly the serf has the ale, the thin daily ale that is so much a part of every meal that it barely registers as a drink, barely registers as separate from the meal itself, just the liquid that the meal comes with, the way bread comes with a meal, or salt comes with a meal, something so constant it becomes invisible. You stand up from the bench, and you feel the bread in your stomach, present, doing its work, and you go outside. The day is cold. It is November, the edge of the lean season, and the bread you have just eaten will be the largest portion of the day. The body that will work through to midday on this breakfast will work through to midday on this bread. And if you are thinking about the gap between what you have eaten and what you are about to ask your body to do, that thinking is a habit the serf does not have, because the serf was never not in this gap. was born in this gap, has worked in this gap every working day of their life, and will work in it until they cannot work any more. The cold air meets the bread in your stomach. You begin. You finish the cup, and you are still thirsty. The morning meal is over. It has lasted perhaps 15 minutes. This is the duration of a serf's morning meal, not because the serf is hurried, not because there is somewhere urgently to be, but because 15 minutes is the correct duration for a meal of bread and cheese and small ale eaten in the early morning before a day of physical labor. The eating is done efficiently, because efficiency is what the day requires, because there is a field waiting, because the light that is now coming through the shutter is the light of a working day beginning, and the body that has eaten this bread and this cheese is now expected to take that bread and that cheese and turn them into the labor of the field, which is the transaction at the center of this life. Grain into bread, into body, into work, into grain. The work of November is the work of late autumn on a strip farm, in the years when life was organized around what the land could provide without machinery. The ploughing of the autumn field for the winter wheat. The clearing of the drainage ditches that, if left, will flood the low strips and rot the roots. The threshing of the grain in the barn that was not finished in October. The hedging and the coppicing and the mending of the things that were broken in summer and deferred to a quieter time that is now. These are the tasks. They are outdoor tasks in November weather, which is to say they are tasks performed in cold that settles into the working body in a way that cold settles into a body that is moving rather than resting. Not the biting cold of standing still, but the persistent grinding cold of an outdoor worker. The cold that is in the hands and the feet no matter how hard the work is. The cold that never quite goes away until the fire is reached at the end of the afternoon. The body burning the breakfast bread through this morning of cold and labor is burning it faster than it would burn it in a warm room. The calorie demand of outdoor work in cold weather is considerably higher than the calorie demand of rest. The bread, which was filling enough when you ate it, is becoming less filling as the morning advances, the body spending it down the way a fire spends its fuel, steadily, without drama, until the store is lower than the demand. By mid-morning, you are hungry. Not desperately hungry, not the hunger of having eaten nothing for a day, but the specific and unmistakable hunger of a body that has been working hard in the cold on a breakfast that was adequate for the hour it was eaten, and is no longer adequate for the hour it is now. This is ordinary. This is the hunger of a serf's morning in November, as it is every November morning, and every November morning before that, for as far back as anyone can remember. The hunger is not alarming. It is simply the condition of the morning, the way cold is the condition of the morning, the way the work is the condition of the morning. You keep working. The serf keeps working. This is the thing that will take the longest to understand if you have not grown up in it. The relationship between hunger and work in a life organized by necessity. In a life where stopping work because you are hungry is not a viable option, not because anyone is preventing you from stopping, but because the field must be plowed before the weather closes and the wheat will not plant itself, and the winter is coming regardless of how hungry you are. In that life, hunger becomes a companion rather than a signal, a presence you carry alongside the work, rather than a condition that terminates the work. The serf does not stop working when hungry. The serf eats when there is something to eat, at the times when eating happens, and between those times the hunger is simply there, present, managed, part of the texture of the day. By midday the hunger is more serious, not dangerous. A healthy body working on rye bread and cheese is not in danger from 4 or 5 hours of hard labor, the stored energy in the bread sufficient for the physical task, even as the conscious experience of hunger grows, but present and demanding, the body making its request in the language of the stomach, the specific hollow ache of a digestive system that has processed what it was given and would like more. You come in from the field at midday. The midday meal, the main meal, the largest of the day, the meal that the morning's work has been aimed at and that the afternoon's work will be sustained by, is the pottage. The pottage is in the pot. It is always in the pot. The pot has been at the fire since before you went out this morning, or since last night. The long, slow heat of the banked fire working on its contents through the hours. And what is in it now is the product of that long cooking. A thick, dense, slightly gelatinous broth, in which peas and beans and whatever root vegetables are available at this time of year have been cooked to complete softness, their cellular structure broken down by heat and time into a porridge-like consistency, the solids and the liquid barely distinguishable from each other, the whole thing a single substance rather than a collection of separate ingredients. The pot is iron, old iron, heavy, the surface of it seasoned by years of use into a dark patina that is the accumulated residue of every meal that has been cooked in it, every bean, every pork bone, every onion. The pot has a history that the household's memory cannot fully reach. It was here before the current inhabitants of this house, and will be here after them, passed down through the generations as the vessel that is as much a part of the household as the fire itself. You do not think about the pot. You think about what is in the pot. You sit down with a wooden bowl of it. The smell reaches you before the taste does. The warm legume smell, the cooked pea smell, faintly earthy, faintly sweet, in the way that starches become sweet when they are cooked long enough. There is something in the smell that the hungry body responds to before the thinking mind has time to form a preference, a deep response to calories in proximity, to the promise of food that is genuinely going to fill and sustain rather than merely occupy the mouth for a moment. You eat it with the bread. The bread goes into the pottage, or the pottage is spooned onto the bread, the thick liquid soaking into the dense crumb and softening it, the two things becoming one thing in the bowl. The fat from whatever small piece of pork or salt bacon has been added to the pot this morning, releasing itself into the broth and giving the whole thing a richness that the peas and beans alone would not have. This is the meal that sustains the working body through the afternoon. This is the daily bread in the literal sense, the daily pottage, the daily pot. The meal that is as reliable as anything in a serf's life is reliable, that is there every day in the same bowl with the same spoon and the same bread and the same fire warming the room and the same bodies eating together at the same table. It is good. This is the thing that surprises. The expectation, carried perhaps from a distance from this food, from the knowledge of how simple and repetitive it is that it will be tolerable, functional, something you eat because it is what there is, rather than because it offers pleasure. The expectation is wrong. The pottage is good in the way that all honest food made from real ingredients and cooked for a long time is good. It tastes of itself, of the peas and the grain and the pork and the herbs that have been in it, of the fire that made it, of the time that was given to it. The pleasure is not the pleasure of variety or novelty or complexity for its own sake. It is the pleasure of sufficiency, of a thing doing exactly what it is meant to do, of a body that has been working all morning, receiving what it needs in exactly the form it needs it. You eat the bowl, you eat another piece of bread, you are full. This too surprises. The completeness of the fullness, the way the pottage and the bread together fill in a way that feels structural, as though the body has received not just calories, but the correct arrangement of them, the protein of the legumes and the starch of the bread and the fat of the pork, in a proportion that the body recognizes and accepts and uses. You sit for a moment after eating, and you feel the food working, the warmth of it spreading through the chest and the stomach, the body doing the first stages of the digestion that will fuel the afternoon. The hunger is gone, not suppressed, not masked, not replaced by the temporary satisfaction of something sweet that will pass in 20 minutes and leave you wanting more. Gone, properly, the request answered, the body's account made up for now. The rye bread and the peas and the pork fat have done what they came to do, and the body that spent the morning being hungry is now the body that has eaten and is ready to work again. This is the serf's relationship with the midday meal. Not pleasure in the abstract, not the pleasure of choice or refinement, or the pleasure of eating something for any reason, other than that it will sustain the working body. The pleasure is inseparable from the hunger that preceded it and the work that necessitated it. Take away the hunger and the work, and the meal becomes something else, something less, something that the people who eat it 300 miles and 500 years removed from this kitchen can only partially understand. You sit for a short while, not long. There is work to return to, the afternoon's portion of the field or the barn or the hedgerow, and the body that has just eaten is temporarily slow, the blood called away from the muscles to the digestion, the post-meal heaviness that is the body doing its triage. The serf knows this heaviness and has always managed it, has always known that the first 20 minutes after the midday meal are not the productive 20 minutes, that the body needs to complete the first stage of digestion before the muscles can have full access to what was just put in them. This is managed not by resting. Rest is not a luxury the November field affords, but by choosing the less demanding tasks for the first part of the afternoon, the tasks that can be done at a slightly lower intensity, the sorting of seed grain, or the mending of small tools, or the work inside the barn that does not require the full force of the body, but that is useful and that fills the time, while the pottage does its work. By mid-afternoon, the heaviness is gone, and the body is running on the midday meal, the peas and the bread and the pork fat converted into the energy of the ploughing or the hedging or whatever task the afternoon requires, and the hunger that was there all morning has not returned yet, and there are perhaps 2 hours of useful light left, and this is the best part of the serf's working day in a November. Fed, working, the body in its proper state of function, the afternoon light doing what it can before it gives out. Then it gives out. The light goes, and you come inside, and the fire is there, the fire that has been there all day, and you sit by it, and the cold begins to leave your hands. The evening meal is smaller. This surprises in the opposite direction from the midday meal, where the pottage surprised with its goodness, the evening meal surprises with its smallness, the body that has been working since before dawn and is now sitting by a fire expecting something commensurate with the day's effort. receiving instead a bowl of pottage that is the same pottage as the midday meal, drawn from the same pot, accompanied by the same bread, and smaller in portion than the midday bowl, because the evening meal is not the meal that sustains work, but the meal that ends the day, and the day is ending, and what the body needs to end the day is not the same as what it needed to sustain the middle of it. You eat the smaller bowl, you eat the bread, you drink the ale, slightly stronger in the evening, the better drawing from the batch, rather than the thin small ale of the morning, and this is one of the small gradations of pleasure in a life that has very few gradations of pleasure in its food. The evening ale, the better ale, the small acknowledgement that the day is done and the body can have something slightly more than it had this morning. The fire burns. The evening. In the firelight, the food you have eaten today accumulates in your mind as a kind of accounting. The 2 pieces of morning bread, the cheese, the thin ale, the bowl of midday pottage with its pork and peas, the afternoon bread, the evening pottage, the evening ale. This is the serf's daily diet in November, in a year of ordinary harvest, in a household that has managed its stores wisely and has enough to reach the spring without the worst reductions. Not feast, not starvation. The middle condition, the ordinary condition, the condition that the majority of people in this time and this place experienced for the majority of their lives. Enough, mostly, to sustain the work that must be done, with very little margin and very little variety and no realistic prospect of either improving. There is a smell in the house tonight that has been there all day and will be there all week. The smell is salt and blood, sharp and mineral, the smell of the autumn slaughter that happened last week and whose work is still everywhere in the household, in the side of bacon hanging from the beam, in the barrel of brine in the corner where the joints are submerging into their preservation, in the lard that was rendered from the fat and poured into its crock, in the black pudding that was made from the blood and is now cooling in a cloth near the fire. November is when the pig dies. The pig has been living on the household's scraps, and the acorns from the wood since October has been putting weight on, has been the household's walking investment in winter provision, and now its investment has been called in. The slaughter is work. Every part of it is work. The killing, the scalding of the carcass in near boiling water so the hair can be scraped, the butchering, the salting, the rendering, the making of the sausage and the black pudding, the smoking of the hams that will be hung above the fire to cure through December and January. Almost nothing is wasted. The feet are boiled for the jelly they produce. The head is made into brawn. The intestines are cleaned and stuffed. The offal, the liver, the kidneys, the heart, is eaten fresh in the days immediately after the slaughter, because offal does not keep, and so you eat it now, in the brief window of fresh meat that the slaughter opens before the preservation takes over. The liver is on the fire tonight. You have been eating preserved food and dried food for long enough that the fresh liver, pan-fried in its own fat over the fire with an onion from the store, has a quality of immediacy and directness that is difficult to account for except as the body responding to something it has been without. The fresh thing, the unpreserved thing, the food that has not been altered from its original state by salt or smoking or drying. The liver is iron-dense and rich and strong in flavor, the kind of flavor that a modern palate sometimes finds difficult, but that a body which has been eating rye bread and pottage for weeks finds genuinely, urgently appealing. You eat it all. You soak the pan with bread. The bread takes on the liver fat and the onion and the small amount of the herbs that were added, and becomes the best bread you have eaten since harvest. After the liver, the serious business of the salt pork. The barrel will provide the household through the winter, the rashers cut thin and added to the pottage, the larger joints brought out on the days when the pottage needs more than dried peas can give it, the fat and the smoke and the salt of it dispersing through the pot and enriching everything it touches. You will not eat the salt pork as a thing in itself, not mostly. It is too precious for that, too necessary to the long project of the winter. But you will taste it in the pottage every time a piece goes in, the salt of it seasoning the whole bowl, the fat of it coating the lips. The serf is not ungrateful for salt pork. The serf has been thinking about this barrel since August, since the pig was assessed and found to be the right weight, since the decision was made about which pigs would go to market and which would go into the barrel. The serf has been thinking about the barrel through September and October, through the weeks of fattening on acorns, through the sharpening of the knife. The arrival of the pork in the barrel is not incidental. It is the culmination of a months-long process of provision, one of the year's great acts of planning, the translation of summer's excess into winter's survival. This is what the serf understands about food that is most difficult to communicate across the distance of time. Food is not separated from the work of producing it. The bread is not separate from the ploughing and the sowing and the reaping that produce the grain and the milling that produce the flour. The pottage is not separate from the garden that grew the peas and the beans and the turnips, the planting and the weeding and the harvesting. The salt pork is not separate from the pig that was raised from a piglet, and the acorns that were gathered, and the salt that was bought at some cost from the market. The food is the work. They are the same thing. When you eat the pottage by the fire on a November evening, you are eating the pottage, yes, but you are also eating the April morning when the peas were planted, and the July afternoon when they were staked against falling over, and the August day when they were gathered, and the September day when they were shelled and spread to dry. You are eating the accumulated labor of the household across the months that preceded this meal, and the flavor of the pottage carries all of that in it in a way that the flavor of food that you have not produced yourself cannot carry. The serf does not think of it this way. The serf does not separate the food from the work that made it, because the serf has never experienced food that was not produced this way. The serf does not know a world in which food arrives without the labor of producing it. But the serf's relationship with the food is shaped by the inseparability of the two, whether or not the serf puts language to it, a relationship of intimate knowledge, of having been present at every stage, of knowing the specific field the rye came from, and the specific weather it came through, and the specific day it was threshed. The variety question is worth sitting with. You have eaten, today, the following things: rye bread, hard cheese, pottage of dried peas and beans, and turnip, and a small amount of salt pork, small ale, liver, slightly stronger ale. Tomorrow you will eat essentially the same things without the liver, which was the fresh kill exception. The day after that, the same things. The day after that, changing slightly as the winter stores are drawn down, or as a particular vegetable runs out, or is supplemented by another. The same things, more or less, for the rest of November and into December and January and February, varying in quality as the stores age and the fresher things become memories, becoming harder and less varied as the winter deepens, and the barrel of salt pork is worked down to the less appealing portions, and the dried peas are the peas that have been stored the longest and have lost some of their vitality in the storing. The modern palate, confronted with this repetition, experiences something that the serf does not experience: boredom. The serf does not experience food boredom in the way you experience it, because the serf has not grown up in a world of food variety, has no default expectation that meals should differ significantly from each other, has no mental database of other foods against which this food is being compared and found lacking. The serf eats the pottage and the bread and the ale in the same way the serf lives in the same house and works the same strips and walks the same paths, as the conditions of the world, not as choices made against a background of available alternatives. The monotony that you feel in this food is a product of your history with food, not of the food itself. The serf's relationship with the pottage is the relationship of a person who has always eaten pottage, and for whom pottage is what food is. This does not make it less monotonous by your measure. It makes it differently experienced. The difference between the two experiences, yours of boredom, the serf's of sufficiency, is one of the more interesting things about inhabiting a different diet. The food is the same food. The experience of the food is entirely different, formed by what you bring to it, which is formed by what you have always brought to food, which is formed by everything you have eaten before this and everything you will eat after. The serf brings to the pottage the knowledge that it is food, that it is warm, that it is what there is, that the hunger that was there before it is now gone. You bring to the pottage everything else. December comes. The diet does not improve in December. It deepens into itself. The variety that existed in November, the fresh turnips and the last of the onions and the autumn herbs, narrowing as the stores age and reduce. The salt pork barrel is opened regularly now, the pieces lifted out and assessed. This piece for today, this piece for later, this fatty end piece set aside for the moment when there is nothing else to put in the pot. The dried peas are working down. The rye in the storage pit is still good, still providing the bread that is the center of every meal. The bread comes from the mill. The grain must be ground before it can become flour, and the flour must become dough before it can become bread. And neither of these steps is optional, and neither of them is quick. The grinding is done at the Lord's mill. The serf is obligated to bring the grain there and to pay a portion of the flour as the miller's fee. And the mill is down the lane past the common, and the walk to it with the grain sack over your shoulder is a walk you make every week or fortnight through the winter, the sack heavier on the way there than on the way back, the return load of flour lighter in weight and infinitely more useful. The mill itself is always loud. The grinding stones turned by the water wheel in the stream or the windmill's arms, depending on the season and the place, produce a constant low thunder that is felt in the bones as much as heard. The vibration of enormous weight turning against enormous weight, the grain falling between them and emerging the other side as something that used to be grain and is now powder. The smell of fresh ground flour is specific and immediate, warm, slightly sweet, the dust of it hanging in the air of the mill and settling on every surface and on you, a fine white-brown coating on the coat and the face and the hair that you will carry home. The miller takes his toll. The toll is a standard measure, a certain fraction of the flour, and there is always a negotiation implicit in it, the miller's assessment of the fraction and the serf's assessment of the fraction being not always the same. the weighing of the toll being a point of tension that runs through every transaction at the mill. The miller is not starving. The miller's family eats well relative to the serf's family. This is understood and resented and also accepted as the shape of things. Because the mill cannot be bypassed, the grain cannot become bread without it, and the arrangement, however tilted, is the arrangement. You carry the flour home. The baking is done in the house or in a shared bakehouse, depending on the village, the dough mixed and kneaded and left to rise near the fire. The leaven added from the piece of dough kept back from the last batch. The continuous culture of the household's yeast that lives in the dough and is fed by each new baking, and that is, in its quiet way, as domestic and as tended as any animal in the yard. A household that loses its leaven, that fails to keep back the necessary peace, that lets the culture die, must borrow from a neighbor, and the borrowing of leaven is a real transaction with a real obligation attached to it. The dough rises slowly in the cold kitchen, faster near the fire, slower in the corners, the temperature of the room governing the pace of the fermentation in the way that temperature governs everything biological. The bread making itself on its own schedule, which is the yeast's schedule, and ultimately the warmth schedule. You learn to read the dough, to know by touch when it is ready, the slow spring of it under the pressed finger, the way it has changed from the tight, dense mass it was when mixed into something looser and more alive, the gas bubbles trapped inside it, making it lighter than it was. Then the oven, or the bake stone over the fire, depending on what the household has. The bread bakes. The smell of baking bread in a house that has been cold and plain-smelling through a winter morning is the smell that the word nourishment would smell like, if it had a smell. Warm and yeasty and slightly caramelized at the edges where the crust is browning, the volatile compounds released by the Maillard reaction reaching the nose and triggering the same ancient response as the roasting meat at Christmas. The body saying yes to this before any consideration of flavor or hunger. The smell of baking bread is one of the things that the serf's kitchen gives freely, even when everything else is rationed. It costs nothing beyond the bread itself. It belongs to every baking day. It fills the house for an hour every few days through the whole of winter. The loaf comes out dark. You let it cool before cutting, or you try to, because bread cut too early is bread with a gummy interior, the crumb not yet set, the steam still working through it. The waiting is difficult. The smell of the cooling loaf makes the waiting difficult. Eventually you cut it, and the crumb is close and grey, and the crust resists the knife, and you have the bread for the next several days, wrapped in cloth, kept from the mice, drawn down piece by piece until the next baking. The bread made from rye that has been stored since September is not the bread of October, is slightly drier, the yeast needing longer to wake it into life, the crust darker, the crumb denser. You eat it. It fills. Christmas brings a change. The change is not dramatic by any standard except the standard of what every other day has been, but by that standard it is dramatic. There is meat. Not the salt pork from the barrel, not the small piece simmered into the pottage until its flavor is everywhere and its substance is nowhere, but actual roasted meat, a joint of something, the joint that came from the obligation of the Lord to provide a feast-day meal to those who work his land. The once-a-year acknowledgement that the arrangement between the Lord and the serf is an arrangement and not simply a condition. The smell of roasting meat crosses the yard. You have been living for weeks in the smell of pottage and fire, and the close-quarters smell of a household in winter. The smell of roasting meat arrives in that context with the force of something from another world, something the body responds to before the mind has fully registered it, the salivary glands and the hunger response activating immediately, the ancient response to animal fat and Maillard reaction products, and the smell of calories concentrating themselves in a hot space above a fire. You turn toward the smell. Everyone turns toward the smell. This is not a refined response. This is the body recognizing exactly what it is smelling and responding accordingly. You eat the meat. The meat is not fine. It is the meat of an animal that spent its life working, a piece of something that was mostly muscle, cooked until it is thoroughly done, which in this context means until it is somewhat dry but safe, the fat having run off into the dripping pan below it. There is none of the pink interior that a modern palate might prefer, none of the tenderness of an animal that was well fed and lightly worked and killed young. This is the meat of a working animal killed old, the fibers tight, the flavor deep and strong, the chewing requiring the same sustained jaw work as the rye bread. You eat it slowly. You eat all of it. You lick your fingers. There is gravy, the drippings thinned with ale and reduced over the fire, and you soak bread in it until the bread is saturated, and you eat that too. For the length of the meal, you are not counting anything. The Christmas feast is not primarily about the food. It is about the departure from the accounting, the temporary suspension of the calculation that governs every other meal. This much grain, this long until spring, this piece of pork against this many days. At the feast that calculation is suspended, and the suspension is itself a form of nourishment, the body and the mind being given something that the regular diet cannot give them, the experience of eating without restraint, of not rationing, of food in quantities that exceed the immediate functional requirement. This is why a feast is a feast, not because the food is fine, but because the restraint is gone. After Christmas, the lean time deepens. January is the month when the stores have been working for 3 months, and their diminishment is becoming visible. The pottage thins, not from intention, but from necessity. The vegetables in it less plentiful as the stored supply reduces. The pork going into the pot less frequently. The pot sometimes containing little more than dried peas in water, with salt and perhaps an onion. This pottage is nutritionally adequate. The dried peas are dense in protein and carbohydrate. The calories are present even when the flavor and fat are not. But it is a diminished version of the November pottage. The pot has less in it. The bowl is smaller. The bread is older. The body notices. You notice it in the specific way of a body that has been eating less than it is spending, a background hunger that does not fully resolve even after the meals, a slight hollowness in the hours between eating that is different from the hunger of an ordinary busy morning. The body has reserves, built through the autumn's eating, and it draws on them now, the fat stored in September and October being metabolized through January's demand, the body sustaining itself through the lean month from its own savings. This is what the body is for, in this understanding of it. Not the body as an end in itself, not the body as an object of cultivation or improvement, but the body as a practical system for converting available food into available work, for storing surplus when surplus is available and drawing it down when it is not, for sustaining function across the full cycle of the year's provision. The serf's body is calibrated to this cycle in the deepest possible way, shaped by generations of the same cycle. Fatten in autumn, thin in winter, build again in spring. Your body is not calibrated to this cycle. Your body does not know about the spring. Your body has never been asked to manage its reserves across a seasonal cycle of this kind. Your body's experience of hunger is the experience of a body that has always been able to address hunger immediately, that has no evolved expectation of a January lean season and a March thaw and an April new growth. Your body treats the January hunger as an emergency rather than a seasonal condition, treats the reduced pottage and the older bread as deprivation rather than as the expected character of this portion of the year.
The serf does not feel deprived in January. The serf feels hungry, yes. The serf is aware that the food is less than it was in autumn and considerably less than it will be in summer. But deprivation requires a comparison, requires the felt gap between what is and what should be. And for the serf, what should be is this, is what is. January is lean. January has always been lean. January will be less lean in 2 months. This is the year's shape, as known and as unsurprising as the year's weather. You eat the thinner pottage. You eat the bread. The bread in January is the bread of stored rye that is 4 months old, and it is still bread, still dark and close-grained, and filling in the way of rye bread. But there is less of it, because the loaves are smaller now, the baker making the same number of loaves from less grain, the thinning visible in the loaf's dimensions, and in the slightly increased space between you and fullness after eating. The household knows this. Nobody remarks on it.
It is January and the bread is smaller, and this is what January is. February brings the question of the ale. The brewing that was done in October and November has been working down through the winter, the barrels less full now, the ale at the bottom of the barrel different from the ale at the top, more sediment, slightly more acid, the yeast having had its way with everything available to it and begun to go sour at the margins. A new batch must be brewed, but new brewing requires grain, and grain in February is grain that must be calculated against the remaining weeks until the spring harvest, and the calculation is always the same uncomfortable calculation. How much can be spared? How much must be kept? Where is the line between the ale that keeps the household drinking safely and the grain that keeps the household eating? The ale that results from a February brewing, made with carefully rationed grain, is thinner than the October ale. It is thinner than the November ale. It is barely thicker than water, with a memory of grain in it. The fermentation, having not very much to work with and having produced not very much in return. You drink it because it is what there is. The taste of it has the faint flatness of something stretched past its natural limit. The brewery's equivalent of the thinner pottage, the product of a process being asked to do more than the inputs quite support. You drink it anyway. Lent arrives. It arrives in February, which is already the lean month, and its dietary requirements impose an additional structure on a diet that is already stretched. No meat on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays through the ordinary year, and no meat for the full 40 days before Easter. The salt pork barrel, already being carefully rationed, closes entirely for 6 weeks at the moment. when the household's need for its fat and protein is greatest. The Church does not ask what is convenient. The Lenten diet in a serf's household is the winter diet minus the one thing that gave it richness. The pottage continues, the bread continues, the ale continues, but the small piece of pork that went into the pot on ordinary days and gave its fat and salt to the whole bowl is absent, and the pottage without it is a plainer thing, the dried peas and the water and whatever herbs the household has, providing a broth that sustains the body, but no longer carries the warm animal.
Richness, the pork added.
Fish is the alternative. The dried salt fish, the stock fish that arrives in the village via the same long supply chain that brings salt itself, traded inland from the coast, expensive in the way of things that must travel, comes out of the store now for the Lenten weeks. You soak it overnight to draw out the worst of the brine, and then cook it in the pottage, and it is adequate. It provides its protein and its fat in the place of the porks, but it is different in every way, sharp and briny where the pork was round and smoky, the sea in it where the land was in everything else. A household near the river has the eel. The eel traps, left overnight in the slow water near the bank, produce eels through these cold months, fat, dark, rich in oil, requiring long cooking to become edible in any pleasant sense, but yielding, when that long cooking is applied, a flavor complexity unlike almost anything else in the winter diet. Eel in the pottage with onion and whatever fresh herbs can be. Found is one of those foods whose reputation has not survived its era, but whose reality, encountered in its context, justifies why the fishing rights on any given stretch of river were contested and valuable. In Lent, the eel is orthodox. In Lent, the eel is the luxury of the riverside household, the thing that gives the 40 days their own specific provision, rather than merely deducting from the ordinary. By the 3rd week of Lent, you have begun to understand the logic of the Church's calendar, not as theology, but as the year's rhythm. The Church's fasting season coinciding with the natural lean season in a way that makes the religious requirement and the agricultural reality into a single condition. You fast because the Church requires it, and you fast because there is less anyway. And the two fasts are the same fast, the abstinence from meat, no great sacrifice in a month when the meat was already nearly gone.
Easter arrives. The salt pork barrel is opened. The first piece of meat on Easter Sunday morning, after 6 weeks of absence, has a quality that the Christmas joint had, and the November liver had, the quality of taste that arrives through absence, the flavor amplified by the weeks without it. You eat it with the same unself-conscious completeness as every previous exceptional meal, the Easter feast having the double pleasure of being the Church's feast and the return from the lean, 2 occasions for celebration collapsed into a single bowl, the Lenten 40 days and the February shortage both ending at once.
The first week of March. There is a quality to the light in the first week of March that is different from the light of February, and the difference is not large. A few minutes more of it at each end of the day, a slightly different angle at midday, the sun a degree or 2 higher in its arc. But it is felt. The body that has been managing January and February in the dark and the cold and the reduced food feels the change in the light before it has fully reasoned through what the change means. The mood lifts. The hunger that has been the background texture of the past 2 months becomes easier to carry, not because it has lessened, the food is still the food it has been, but because the light says spring is coming, and spring means the hunger will end. The spring hunger is real. This is the thing about the medieval diet that the calendar of the year reveals most starkly. The annual cycle does not run smoothly from autumn's plenty to spring's renewal. There is a gap between the two, a gap that falls in March and April, and sometimes into May, when the winter stores are exhausted and the new growth has not yet arrived. The stored grain is mostly gone. The salt pork barrel is empty or near empty. The dried peas are the last of what was laid in the autumn, and the new crops, the spring-planted vegetables, the new grain, are still weeks away from providing anything, still in the ground doing their patient, invisible work. The spring hunger is the real hunger, the hunger that is not the background hunger of January's lean season, but the hunger of genuine shortfall, of the stores having run out before the land has replenished them, of the household having reached the bottom of what was put away. In a good year, this gap is manageable. The watercress in the stream is edible in March, one of the first green things available after the long brown of winter, and the body that has been eating dried and stored food for 5 months falls on the fresh green thing with a gratitude that is partly nutritional. The vitamins in the fresh green leaf are things the winter diet has not provided, and partly the gratitude of the senses for something bright and alive in the mouth after months of the dark and the salted and the fermented. The wild garlic comes a few weeks later, the leaves pushing through the woodland floor in the first warmth, available free to anyone who walks into the wood and bends down, a flavor so vivid after the long plain winter that the first mouthful of it has a quality almost like shock. The dandelion leaves are eaten, and the nettle tips, gathered young before they sting, boiled until they soften, and eaten as a kind of desperate green vegetable, the body extracting from them whatever they have to give. These things sustain the gap. In a bad year, the gap sustains the fever. This is the fact that lives underneath the whole year's diet, the fact that every household in every village in this time is aware of, in the way they are aware of the weather, that the margin between enough and not enough is narrow, and that the line between the spring hunger and the spring sickness is not a long line to cross. A body depleted by months of reduced food and cold and hard labor is a body with a diminished capacity to resist the infections that March and April also bring, the crowded winter quarters having incubated whatever was going around, the weakened immune function of the chronically underfed, making what would be a minor illness in a well-nourished body into something that can become serious. The serf knows this, not in these terms, not in the language of immune function and infection and nutritional depletion, but in the lived knowledge of every spring's accounting, the looking around the village after winter to see who came through, the knowledge that the old and the very young are at the most risk, and that the spring after a bad winter takes some of them. The spring hunger is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous at the margins, and the serf knows the margins from the inside, has always lived at the margins, has always understood the hunger in the context of what hunger can become if it goes on long enough. You eat the watercress from the stream. It is cold from the water,
and it is bright and green and slightly bitter in the way of fresh green things that have not been cooked, and have not been salted, and have not been stored in a barrel for 3 months. You eat it standing at the bank of the stream in the early March morning, with the cold water over your boots, and the pale light of early spring on the water, and the food in your hand is the most vivid thing you have tasted in months. The body receives it, not with the polite acknowledgement of a body receiving something tolerable, with something closer to relief, the fresh thing, the alive thing, the thing that has been growing in running water right up until this moment, rather than drying in a storage pit since September. The body receives it the way the body receives water after thirst, immediately, completely, with the clarity of something being given exactly what it needed. You eat more of it than is wise for a stomach that has been on winter food.
Later that day you regret this. This too is the serf's experience of early spring, the enthusiasm of the hungry body for the first fresh things, the digestive system that has spent 5 months processing dried and salted and stored food, encountering suddenly the raw vitality of fresh greens, and responding to the contrast with a vehemence that is uncomfortable. The balance reasserts itself over a few days as the diet adjusts, as the fresh things become more available, and the body relearns the processing of them. But the first week of fresh spring greens is always somewhat turbulent for the body that has been without them. April. The garden is planted. The strips in the common field have had their spring grain sown. The hedgerows are leafing out. The world, which was brown and grey and the dark of bare soil for months, is becoming green, and the greening is felt in the diet before it is felt fully in the stores, because the green things of spring are edible now, but the grain and the vegetables of the new planting are still months away. The eggs arrive. The hens, which have been entirely unhelpful through the winter months, the short dark days, and the cold, having persuaded them that egg production was not their responsibility from October through February, begin again. The first egg of spring is not dramatic. It is a single egg, found in the straw of the hen house on an April morning, still warm, unremarkable in itself and remarkable only in its context. The return of plenty, the first evidence that the winter is behind you, the first thing that is new in the truest sense, produced this morning by an animal that was incapable of producing it yesterday. You hold it in your palm. You have eaten eggs before, stored eggs, eggs preserved in salt or in the cool of the cellar through the worst months. But those eggs are different from this egg. This egg is new. You take it inside and you cook it in the pan over the fire, the fat from the last of the winter pork going in first, the egg going in and setting immediately, the edges crisping in the fat, the yolk going from liquid to thick as you watch, and you eat it with the bread, and it is the first egg of spring, and the body that has been eating salt pork and dried peas and rye bread for 5 months receives it with something that is not quite religious, but is adjacent to it, a gratitude so complete and so immediate that it requires no analysis. The pottage begins to change. In May, the new vegetables arrive, the first of the spring onions from the kitchen garden, their green tops bright and sharp, the fresh pea shoots from the climbing plants at the garden's edge, the young turnip greens that are nothing like the old stored turnips of January. These go into the pot, and they change it. The pottage of May is not the pottage of January. The pottage of May has colour in it, has the bright green of the fresh vegetable mixed into the dull earth of the dried pea base, has a liveliness to its flavour that the winter pottage lost by November and did not recover until now. You taste the May pottage, and you taste the spring in it, the season made edible, the ground having done its work and delivered it to the pot. The ale is brewed fresh from the new grain. There is a moment in late spring, after the new brewing and before the harvest anxiety of July, when the serf's diet approaches something that could be called comfortable. The stores are not yet exhausted, and the new production is underway. The bread is fresh from recently milled grain. The pottage is full of new vegetables. The ale is new and good. The eggs are plentiful. The garden is giving its first real yields. This is not abundance. Abundance is the Lord's table, the feast day's exception. But it is sufficiency with a margin, the rare condition of having enough and knowing, at least for these few weeks, that enough will continue. You eat well in late May. The summer is the summer of the working body at its best fed, and it deserves more than a summary. June is the month of the longest light and the busiest work and the fullest kitchen garden. The lettuces that were sown in March are at their peak now, broad-leafed and sweet. The bitterness of the very young leaf replaced by something more complex, the flavor of a plant that has been growing for 2 months in the warming soil. You eat them fresh, without cooking, which is unusual. Most of what you eat has been transformed by heat, or salt, or drying. And the freshness of them, the crunch, the water in them, the bright flavor, is a quality of food that November has nothing like. The radishes are ready, small and sharp and red, eaten between meals as a thing that is simply there and available and requires no preparation. The peas, which were dried last year and are now running out as the last of the winter stores deplete themselves, are replaced in June by the new peas, the fresh ones still in their pods, eaten raw as you pick them from the vine. Sweet, in the way that fresh peas are sweet, the sweetness that lasts for approximately 12 hours after the pea is picked and begins immediately to convert to starch, which is why the pea eaten standing at the vine is sweeter than the pea eaten at the table an hour later. You eat them at the vine. The ale in June is the spring brewing, made in April from the new season's grain, and it is at its best now. Lively, slightly hazy, the fermentation having had time to work through, but not so long that the freshness has gone. You drink it after the morning's work, with a quality of pure satisfaction that the February ale, that thin, strained thing, could not approach. The ale is the same ale, the same recipe, the same household knowledge, but it is not the same ale. June ale is what ale is, when ale has enough to work with. July is the anxious month. The standing grain in the field is everything, and July is when everything can go wrong. The rust that appears on the wheat stalks, the grey spore colonies of it, the pale patches in the field that mean the grain underneath is being consumed before it can be harvested. The rain that comes too heavy too late, flattening the standing grain so it lies on the ground and begins to rot. The heat that comes too sudden and too dry, shriveling the grain in the ear before it has fully formed. You watch the sky in July the way the serf has always watched it. Not with pleasure, but with the specific anxiety of someone whose winter depends on what the sky decides to do. The clouds assessed for their intentions, the wind direction noted, the early morning light checked against what it was yesterday. But in a good year, in this good year, the grain stands. The July ale is made from the old grain, the grain that has been in store since the previous autumn, and there is less of it now because the supply has been working down for 10 months. But what there is used carefully. The household drinking the ale at the measured pace of people who know there will not be more of this batch, that the next batch depends on the harvest that is coming and has not come yet. The July ale is a rationed pleasure, drunk in smaller amounts than the June ale, the cup replenished with water in the cup first, so the ale goes further. You notice this. You notice it as the serf notices it, not as deprivation, but as the ordinary arithmetic of the household at this point in the year. The stores are counted, the calculation is made, the consumption is adjusted. This is the annual reckoning that every household makes without discussing it. The continuous invisible management of what is available against what is needed. The sum that is constantly being revised as the year moves and the stores move with it. August. The grain is nearly ripe. The ears are full and golden and heavy enough that the stems bend slightly under the weight of them. The field in late August a landscape of abundance that is also a landscape of urgency, because ripe grain waits for nothing. The weather that can flatten it comes without warning. The birds that eat it come without invitation. The moment of perfect ripeness is brief, and the harvest must happen inside it. The food in August is the best food of the year, and the work in August is the hardest work of the year, and the two together produce the condition of the harvest. The body, at the peak of its physical capacity, fueled by the summer's best diet, asked to give everything it has in the shortest possible time, working from before dawn to after dark for days on end, the urgency of the harvest overriding the body's need for rest, the way no other urgency in the agricultural year can override it. You eat well in August, the morning meal before the harvest. Day is larger than the November morning meal. The household knows what the day will require and provides accordingly. The bread more and the cheese more and an egg if there are eggs, and the ale fuller. The midday meal is eaten in the field, carried out in the morning and eaten in the brief stop at noon. The pottage in the pot kept warm somehow. The bread that was baked yesterday eaten with whatever the garden has given this week. You eat quickly, and you return to the field. The evening meal is eaten after dark, the last of the light having been used to the final sheaf, and you come in with the harvest smell on your clothes, the dry, sweet, dusty smell of cut grain, of chaff, of the particular quality of a field that has just been reaped, and you eat whatever there is with an appetite that has the same character as the March watercress appetite, but in the other direction. The appetite of a body that has spent everything and is presenting its full accounting to the evening pot. There is sometimes fruit, the plums from the tree at the edge of the orchard, the apples in August, the blackberries in the hedgerow in September that leave the fingers dark and the mouth slightly tart, and that are eaten standing in the hedgerow because they are there, and because September means they will not be there for long. The fruit is sweet, genuinely sweet, the natural sweetness of ripe fruit in a diet that almost never encounters the sweetness of refined sugar, the sweetness of fruit being therefore not a minor note in the flavor, but a major one, a whole register of taste that the diet has been largely without, and that the body responds to with the particular pleasure reserved for things that are rare enough to be noticed. You eat the blackberries. You eat more of them than you intended to. The evening ale after a harvest day is a different substance from the ale of any other day. Not because the ale is different, because you are different. The ale of a harvest evening enters a body that has been in the sun all day, that has swung a scythe or bound sheaves from early morning, that has sweat through the back of the shirt and ached in the shoulders, and been thirsty by mid-morning and hungry by mid-afternoon, and is now sitting on the bench with the day's work done, and the grain in the barn, and the cup in the hand. In this body, in this moment, the ordinary thin ale of this household in this season is exactly the drink that the day requires, and you drink it with the attention it deserves, which is considerable. This year the number leaves a margin. You feel this in the atmosphere of the harvest home, the meal taken in the field on the last day of the reaping, the meal that the Lord provides to the workers as his side of the harvest bargain. And it has something of the same quality as Christmas, the calculation briefly suspended, the accounting set aside, the body given more than its functional portion. You eat it in the field. The bread is the fresh bread of new grain, flour ground this week from wheat that was growing in this field a fortnight ago, and it is a completely different bread from the January bread, different in color and in weight and in flavor, the fresh flour producing a lightness and a sweetness that the stored rye of midwinter cannot approach. You eat it, and you taste the summer in it, the sun and the rain and the work of the season, all converted into this bread, which is the year's work made edible, the whole long argument of the agricultural year resolved into the simple fact of good bread. You eat a large piece of it. You eat another. There is ale brewed from the new grain, and it is the first ale of the new year's production, still slightly green, not yet at its best, but already better than anything that has come out of the barrels since April, and you drink it with the specific appreciation of a person who has spent the summer on the old supplies and is now tasting what the new harvest tastes like. The harvest meal has meat. The Lord's contribution, the obligation that the harvest arrangement imposes on him, as surely as the obligation to reap imposes itself on the serf, is the joint or the pottage made with proper meat, the food that marks the day as exceptional within the year's ordinary. You eat it slowly, the way you have eaten every exceptional thing this year, slowly, with attention, with the knowledge that this is not the ordinary, and that the ordinary is what waits on the other side of the afternoon. The evening comes on early, in September, earlier than July's long evenings, and you eat the last of the harvest meal in the gathering dusk, with the cut field around you, and the stooks of grain still standing in the nearer portion, and the sound of the other workers, and the fire that someone built at the field's edge. The September harvest. This is the culmination, the point toward which the whole year has been moving, the thing that the spring planting and the summer maintenance and the August watching of the sky have all been aimed at. The grain in the sheaves, the grain in the barn, the grain in the storage pit, the grain against the winter. The harvest is not merely the production of food. The harvest is the calculation of the year's survival, the determination of whether the margin will hold, whether the winter will be ordinary, or whether it will be the winter that strips the household to its bones and leaves it at the spring hunger's mercy. The calculation happens at the threshing. When the grain is threshed out of the sheaves on the barn floor, the flails rising and falling, the rhythmic work of the threshing that separates the grain from the straw, the amount that comes out of the straw, is the number that governs the year. You count it. The household counts it. The village counts it. In its aggregate, the individual strips together, making up the community's provision. The total grain of the common field now accessible as a number against the winter's length. A good harvest is a number that leaves a margin. A poor harvest is a number that does not. You are full. You are more than full. You are the body at the end of a year of the serf's diet, having gone through November's adequacy, and December's maintaining, and January's thinning, and February's stretch, and March's relief, and April's returning, and May's brief plenty, and June's summer, and July's anxious watching, and August's hard plenty, and September's harvest. And you are sitting in the field, with the harvest bread in your hands, and the full pot behind you, and the year's work done, and the stores accumulating, and the winter ahead, understood now as a thing you have done before and will do again. The body that has been through all of this is not the body that sat at the morning bench in November with the first heavy bread in its hands. That body knew nothing. This body knows the whole year. It knows the bread in November, heavy and filling and dark. It knows the pottage in January, thin and reliable and honest. It knows the first watercress of March, and the first egg of April, and the first new pottage of May. It knows the June lettuces eaten raw at the garden edge, and the July ale rationed into smaller cups, and the August harvest urgency, and the September blackberries with their dark fingers. It knows the ale at every stage of its cycle, the thick good ale of autumn, and the strained thin ale of February, and the new ale of spring. It knows the Christmas joint, and the harvest meal, and the liver pan-fried on the November evening after the slaughter, and it knows the long ordinary days between the feasts, when the food is the food it has always been, and the hunger is the hunger it has always been, and the filling is the filling that has always been sufficient. Not comfortable, not various, not the diet of a person who can choose, but the diet of a person who is alive, who is fed across the full turning of the year, who knows every flavor, and every season, and every shortage, and every abundance in the particular intimate way of someone for whom food is not background, but foreground, not assumption, but daily reality, not pleasure in the abstract, but the specific pleasure of the specific thing, eaten at the specific point of the specific hunger in the specific season of the year. The fire has been lit. The autumn evening is coming in. You carry the last sheaf in from the field. The barn door closes on the year's grain. The pot is on the fire. The bread is on the board. The ale is in the cup. You sit down. You eat.